Picture this. A frozen hillside hammered by cold rain, the kind that cuts through a wool cloak like a knife. A lone medieval shepherd stands there, soaked shoulders, heavy breath fogging in the dark, his fingers numb, his spine shivering. No tent, no wood left for a real fire, no real shelter, just wet wool, a few warm stones, and a huddle of sheep pressed close against the storm. You'd think he froze, but he didn't, because warmth out here isn't fire, it's knowledge. The hillside tests men, and this man knows every trick the old ones left behind. He reads the wind, he finds the rain's shadow, he traps heat wherever he can. So how do you sleep when rain turns your blanket to ice? That's the story tonight. On a frozen hillside hammered by cold rain, a medieval shepherd knew his first enemy wasn't the storm. It was the ground, hard as iron, wet enough to steal the warmth right out of his bones. One wrong move, one careless place to lie down, and the cold would climb into his spine and stay there. That's why the old shepherds learned to shape the earth the way a craftsman shapes wood, not fighting nature, but bending it. He'd scan the slope cloak, dripping fingers, numb breath, turning white in the dark. Then he'd pick a spot just below the wind line, not too low, not too high. A place where sleet slid past instead of pooling. With a dull knife or bare hands, he'd scrape out a shallow hollow in the frozen soil, just deep enough for his hip and shoulder, just wide enough to curl into. That hollow was only half the trick. The real magic came from the turf. Wet turf, heavy turf, the kind most men would ignore. But shepherds knew the truth. Turf stops wind. Turf redirects water. Turf becomes a wall when nothing else will stand. So he'd stack it around the hollow building, a small earth bank, no higher than a man's knee. No fancy tools, no perfect shapes, just instinct and practice. And when the rain hit that turf wall, it split, rolled, and spilled away from his body. Suddenly, the storm felt different. Less wind, less water, more warmth. Inside that little pocket of earth, heat trapped itself inside his wool cloak instead of drifting into the night. His shivering spine steadied, his soaked shoulders eased. The hillside still tested him, but now he had a fighting chance. Simple, ancient, effective, and maybe that's the lesson buried in the mud. Survival isn't always about strength. Sometimes it's about shaping a small corner of the world into safety. Out here, warmth is just another name for knowing what to do, and silence becomes a shelter. Out on that frozen hillside, the rain didn't just fall, it hammered. Sheets of cold rain came straight down into the shepherd's sleeping spot, turning wet wool into a cold sponge, every drop stealing heat, every gust cutting deeper. And when your cloak gets soaked like that, your body bleeds warmth faster than you can make it. That's why the old shepherds learned a trick most folks today would never guess. They turned their cloak into a roof. He'd hunch under the storm-soaked shoulders, shaking fingers stiff from the cold. Then he'd grab a crooked stick, a flat stone, anything with shape and strength. With a few practice motions, he'd prop the wool cloak up at a slanted angle, just steep enough for the rain to slide instead of sink. Water loves a slope. A shepherd knows that. Give it the right path, and it'll rush off behind you instead of into your back. So he'd curl beneath that little wool canopy, breath fogging in the dark, listening to the rain sliding off like 1,000 tiny arrows deflected by a shield. Wet wool on top, dry wool below, and held between them was the secret every hill shepherd learned the hard way. A small roof is still a roof, and even a thin roof buys you time. Then the payoff came fast. Less water, less cold, less lost heat. Under that angled cloak, a pocket of warmth slowly formed around his chest and stomach. His shivering spine eased. The cutting wind softened to a whisper, and for a few precious minutes, the hillside stopped feeling like an enemy and more like a test he knew how to pass. Old trick, harsh weather, still works. They didn't have tents. They didn't have a fire left burning, but they had wool and the wisdom to use it. And maybe that's the quiet truth of those nights. Sometimes all a man needs is a dry space no wider than his shoulders to make it till dawn. On nights when the cold rain hit like sleet and the wind clawed across the frozen hillside, the shepherd's greatest ally wasn't fire. It was the flock itself, a living wall, a moving furnace, a circle of heat in a world that wanted him gone. Sheep huddle by instinct when storms roll in. They press shoulder to shoulder, wet wool's steaming breath fogging into the dark. And the shepherd, numb fingers, shaking soaked shoulders, aching, knew exactly what that meant. High body heat, natural insulation, a barrier no cutting wind could pass through. He didn't have a tent. He didn't have a stove. But he had 50 heartbeats pounding warmth into the storm. So he'd guide the flock with quiet taps and soft calls, pushing them toward the windward side of the slope, the side that took the worst of the weather, the side he couldn't face alone. Once they settled, he'd slip to the leeward side right behind that wool wall. Then came the final touch. He'd pull his cloak over himself and over the closest sheepbacks, creating a shared heat trap under the dripping fabric. That's when the change hit. The wind softened, the rain eased, and the warmth returned. Not a blaze of heat, just a steady pulse, enough to calm his shivering spine, enough to keep the cold from stealing his breath, enough to buy him the minutes of sleep he needed to see the next hour. And in those moments, lying against warm wool, listening to the slow chewing and quiet bleats around him, he learned the kind of truth only storms can teach. Survival isn't always about standing alone. Sometimes it's knowing when to lean into the herd. Out here, the smartest thing you can do is follow the heat. And the oldest, most reliable heat in the world has always come from another living body. Simple, ancient, effective. Before the storm rolled in, when the sky was only bruised with dark clouds, a medieval shepherd would do one small thing that kept him alive later. He'd heat stones. Not many, just 2 or 3 warmed beside a small evening fire before the rain swallowed the night. Because once the cold rain started pouring, fire was off the table. No flame survives that kind of downpour, but warm stones do. He'd wrap those stones in scraps of wool or spare cloth, trapping the heat the same way the earth traps the last bit of daylight. Then, when the hillside turned into a sheet of sleet and the wind pushed like a giant hand, he'd slide one of those stones under his cloak, right near the belly or the hip, the place where warmth spreads fastest. At first, it didn't seem like much. A little glow, a slow pulse. But out there, with breath fogging and shoulders soaked, that pulse meant everything. It carved out a pocket of warmth inside the storm, a tiny refuge under dripping wool. A reminder that not all heat needs fire. Then the payoff came. Steady warmth, less shaking, sleep finally possible. The stone stayed warm far longer than you'd expect, even as rain hammered the hillside. And the shepherd, curled beneath his cloak, could feel life easing back into his spine. That stubborn warmth held him together while the world outside tried to pull him apart. A single stone at the right moment could stand in for an entire hearth. That's the kind of wisdom men didn't read in books. They learned it on nights when the cold wanted to take everything. And maybe that's the quiet truth of survival. Sometimes the smallest thing you save during daylight becomes the thing that saves you in the dark. On those nights when cold rain beat the hillside flat and the wind felt sharp enough to carve bone, the shepherd had one big problem. His cloak took the full force of the storm. Wet wool, heavy wool, wool that stuck to his skin and robbed him of the air he needed to stay warm. A single layer wasn't enough, not in weather like that. But the old shepherds knew something most people forget today. It's not the wool that keeps you warm, it's the air trapped inside it. So he'd work with what he had. A wool shirt close to the skin, a wool cloak on top, 2 layers, but never pressed tight together. He'd shake out the fabric, create that puffed zone between them, and pull the edges close so the rain rolled off instead of soaking through. The outer layer took the beating. The inner layer held the heat. And between them was a tiny air gap, quiet, invisible, but powerful. It didn't look impressive. It didn't feel like armor. But out there on the frozen hillside, it made all the difference. because that little pocket of air turned into a pocket of warmth, and then the payoff showed up in minutes. Drier shoulders, warmer chest, heat held longer, his shivering spine calmed, his breath steadied. Even as the cloak dripped and the storm howled, that small separation, just a few fingers' width, kept the cold from owning him. One stone, one night, one more chance. Air, the one thing you can't see, but the thing that keeps a man alive when everything else fails. And maybe that's the quiet lesson hidden in that storm. Sometimes the smallest gap between you and the world is the thing that saves you. Just like the small space we keep between ourselves and the storms of life. On a frozen hillside, cold rain never falls straight. It bounces, slides, curls around stone, and hits sideways when you least expect it. One wrong sleeping spot on a night like that, and the water cuts through your cloak and straight into your bones. A shepherd couldn't afford that, not when the storm wanted everything he had left. But the old shepherds knew the land like an old friend. They knew rock could shelter you, if you stood in the right place. He'd study the slope with a dripping cloak and numb fingers, watching how rain traveled down the large stones scattered across the hillside. Some stones were tall enough, angled just right to split the rain's path. Beneath those edges was a tiny dry zone, what shepherds called the rain shadow, a pocket of safety the storm couldn't reach. So he'd lean his back against the high side of the rock, feeling its cold but steady strength. Then he'd shift just a little half a step a tilt of the shoulder until the rain curved past him instead of into him. Suddenly, the rock became a roof, a shield carved by centuries of wind. The payoff came fast. Less rain on his chest, less cold sinking in. Sleep finally possible. Curled under that stone-edged breath, fogging the air cloak dripping at the corners, he felt warmth settle back into his core. No fire, no tent, just a rock splitting the storm long enough for him to breathe. Simple, ancient, effective. Nature always leaves a narrow, safe passage for the man patient enough to look. And sometimes that's all survival is, sliding half a step into the quiet where the world stops trying to drown you. On the coldest, wettest nights, when the wind spun in circles and the rain stung like needles, the shepherd turned to his last defense. Not a tool, not a shelter, just his body shaped the right way. Because when a storm hits from every direction, even the best cloak can't cover a man stretched out long. Too much surface, too much heat slipping away into the dark. The old shepherds discovered something quietly brilliant. Warmth isn't just what you wear, it's how small you make yourself. He'd curl into a tight fetal shape, knees drawn to his chest spine, settling into a natural curve. Then he'd wrap his wool cloak around himself in a full circle, tucking every edge under his arms or legs. A complete seal. No gaps, no drafts. A scrap of wool at the collar kept warm breath from escaping. Head bowed, he almost felt his own heartbeat warming the space beneath the cloak. In that compact shape, he lost almost no heat. Smaller body, smaller target, smaller loss, and the payoff came fast. Less exposure, less shivering, more warmth held tight. Inside that little cocoon, breath fogging the wool, he finally slipped into short, precious sleep. Never deep, he still had a flock to guard, but deep enough to survive another hour of the storm. The frozen hillside still challenged him, but now he met it with instinct, not desperation. Simple, ancient, effective. The body knows how to survive if we let it. And maybe that's the quiet truth of these nights. Sometimes curling inward isn't weakness. It's the instinct that keeps us alive, tightening up, holding warmth close, and waiting out the storm. And then slowly, the storm loosened its grip. The cold rain thinned. The wind lost its teeth. Dawn finally brushed the frozen hillside with a pale glow, revealing a shepherd curled beside his flock cloak, dripping but alive. He never had waterproof gear, no sleeping bag, no modern shelter, just earth stone sheep and wool. Yet he turned them into tools of survival, because warmth isn't only fire. Warmth is knowledge passed down by men who face nights far worse. The hillside tests men, but the old ways carry them through. And if tonight looked brutal, remember this: On the nights even harsher than this one, they still had one more strange technique.